Good morning, everybody. We're extremely happy to welcome back to the center today a dear friend of our society, Dr. Jeffrey Long, who is Professor of Religion and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, where he has taught since receiving his doctoral degree from the University of Chicago Divinity School in the year 2000. His published work includes 4 books, one of which is an introduction to Jainism, and most recently an edited volume titled Perspectives on Reincarnation, Hindu, Christian, and Scientific. The reincarnation volume can be downloaded for free at the website of MDPI Publishers. Last year, Dr. Long received the Hindu American Foundation's Dharma Seva Award for his work to promote an accurate and sensitive presentation of Hinduism in the American educational system and media. He is a longtime practitioner of Vedanta, and last year he and his wife, Mahua, established the Vedanta Society of Central Pennsylvania at their home in Elizabethtown. The subject of his talk this morning is Jainism and Vedanta, a comparative study. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya, Tamaso Ma Jyotir Gamaya, Mrityor Ma Amritang Gamaya. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I always feel I'm being welcomed home when I come to a Vedanta society. Good morning, namaste, namaskar, and to use the traditional Jain greeting, Jai Jinendra. I'd like to note, did any of my friends from the Jain Center of New York come today? No, well, that's okay. But I'm very grateful to all of you for being here today. It's a great honor, and it's something for which I'm deeply grateful to speak once again here at the Vedanta Society of New York, established by Swami Vivekananda himself in 1894. I would also like to wish everyone a happy Guru Purnima and a happy Father's Day. These two have come together very beautifully this year, haven't they? On this auspicious occasion, Swami Sarvapriyananda has asked me to speak to you about Jainism, a tradition that is certainly distinct from Vedanta, but that also has a great deal in common with it. For those of you who do not know me, I've been a member of the Vedanta Society for a number of years now. My wife and I both took initiation from Swami Tyagananda at the Boston Ramakrishna Vedanta Society in 2005, though both of us have been drawn to Vedanta for much longer, going back to our respective childhoods. Mahua's in India, mine in Missouri. I've also, in the course of my career, done a fair amount of research on the Jain tradition and wrote a textbook on this tradition titled Jainism, an Introduction, which was published in 2009. By the way, I also want to mention one of my former students is here, Danielle. Had I published that book yet when you were there? I think I was still writing it. Oh, well, thank you. Oh, she bought it. Okay, very good. Oh, wonderful. Very good. I'm grateful to say that this work has been warmly received by the Jain community, and Jainism, an Introduction, is even used as a textbook in the International Summer School for Jain Studies that's run every year by members of the Jain community in New Delhi. In just 3 more weeks, I'm scheduled to speak at the annual convention of JINA, the Jain Association in North America, which is to be held in Los Angeles, California. And last year, I had the honor of speaking at the Indian Consulate right here in New York on the occasion of Mahavir Jayanti, the holy day celebrating the birth and enlightenment of the great Jain sage Mahavira. Over the course of my career, I've been told by some scholars that my interpretation of Vedanta bears some resemblances to Jainism. I've also been told by some other scholars that my interpretation of Jainism sounds a great deal like Vedanta. My presentation today will probably prove that both of these groups have a point, for I shall argue that while there are indeed significant differences between these two philosophies, Jainism and Vedanta, there's also an important sense in which they share a philosophical vision. This is especially the case of Jainism and the Vedanta taught by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, and the Vedanta of the Vedanta Society. I'll begin with a very broad overview of both Jainism and Vedanta, spending somewhat less time explicating Vedanta on the assumption that most of you are already very familiar with it, this being the Vedanta Society. I'll then briefly speak on what has drawn me to both traditions, to the practice of Vedanta and to the study of Jainism, and then delve into the central point in my presentation, which is that the vision these true traditions share is one of pluralism, in which all worldviews are given respect, and in which each is seen as capturing at least an aspect of the infinite truth. I see this vision as being of particularly urgent importance in our world today, a world characterized by deep suspicion and even violence among communities based on differences of belief and practice. So, moving to the broad comparative overview of Jainism and Vedanta, the obvious similarities between Jainism and Vedanta arise from their having originated in India. Adherents of these two traditions share the same basic cosmology that's shared across all the Indic religious traditions, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Sikh. Jains and Vedantins both believe that the cosmos has always existed, there being no such thing as an absolute beginning of time, but that the realm of time, space, and causation goes through periodic cycles of arising, persistence, and destruction. Thus, this particular universe, the one we're inhabiting right now, had a beginning, which according to modern science occurred with the Big Bang about 14 billion years ago, on a timescale quite compatible with the shared vision of the Indic traditions. It will also have an end, which is also quite far in the future. But this end will be followed by another beginning. A new cosmic cycle will start, and so on, to infinity. Similarly, our current universe was itself preceded by an earlier one, and another before that, and another before that, again to infinity. The details of this process differ between the two traditions. According to the Vedantic vision, creation, preservation, and destruction are presided over by a supreme being, a deity whose function is to ensure the smooth unfolding of the cosmic process. In the mode of creation, this deity is known as Brahma, in the mode of preservation as Vishnu, and in the mode of destruction for the sake of recreation as Shiva. Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva are each accompanied by Shakti, or power, who makes possible their respective activities. Saraswati, Lakshmi, and the mother goddess, variously known as Devi, Uma, Parvati, Durga, Kali, or simply Shakti. According to the Jain vision, no such presiding deity is necessary to account for the smooth unfolding of the cosmic process, which can be explained fully by the workings of karma, the law of cause and effect that is also affirmed by both Jains and Vedantins, as well as by Buddhists and Sikhs. According to Jainism and Vedanta, and again all the Indic traditions, we living beings in the realm of time, space, and causation are undergoing a process of rebirth, a cycle known as samsara. As individuals, this lifetime is not our only existence. Rather, as Lord Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, there was never a time when you and I did not exist, nor is there any time in the future when we shall cease to be. Just as a person discards old and worn-out clothing and takes on a new set of clothing, thus does the embodied soul discard one body and take on another. The wise are not deluded by these changes. Jains and Vedantins thus share the reassuring view that when we lose our loved ones, they have not ceased to exist. They've simply changed form. Just as contemporary physics states that energy and matter, which are really the same thing, are never really destroyed. They simply change their state of being. Our loved ones carry on their existence in another form, and we shall do the same. We may even reassociate in the future. Similarly, it may well be that those who are near and dear to us today were our loved ones in former lives, and that we are now reassociating. And it may be that those with whom we have conflicts are souls with whom we've been in conflict in the past, and we still have yet to resolve our differences. And yes, that will keep you coming back until you get it worked out. In both Jainism and Vedanta, though, the continuation of existence in the physical form, even though it's reassuring in the face of personal tragedy and loss, is not the ultimate aim of life. In fact, samsara is seen in both traditions as a form of suffering, a teaching also found prominently in Buddhism. Our ultimate aim is to move from this time-bound, impermanent, and constantly shifting existence to the realm of the eternal. In the words of the Upanishads, which we just recited, from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. Death meaning the constant re-death that we experience as long as we're in this realm of samsara. Our aim, in other words, according to both traditions, is moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth. According to both Jainism and Vedanta, we're bound to the cycle of rebirth by karma, the law of causation according to which each of our actions produces an effect. These effects must be experienced by the doer of the action. As doers of action, we're therefore bound to experience the effects of our actions. This leads to rebirth because, as we are constantly engaged in action, new effects are constantly being created for us to experience. So even at the moment of death, residual effects are still present, which will pull us back into the cycle of rebirth, almost like a gravitational or magnetic pull being exerted on matter. In regard to the details, the mechanics, if you will, of how karma works and how one becomes free from the karmic process, there are both similarities and differences between Jainism and Vedanta. I just mentioned the idea of karma as something akin to a gravitational or magnetic pull being exerted on the soul, drawing it inexorably into the realm of rebirth after the death of the physical body. From a Jain point of view, this is exactly what is happening. According to Jain teaching, karma is not simply the law of causation, though it is that as well. It's also a type of matter or energy which adheres in a very literal physical way to the soul, causing it to experience karmic effects. The aim of Jain practice is to purify the soul of this karmic matter. This matter obscures the true nature of the soul, the jiva, and keeps it bound to a physical body. When the jiva is free from karma, it then manifests its true nature as infinite knowledge, infinite perception, infinite bliss, and infinite energy. It is then forever free, residing in a realm known as the Siddhaloka, the realm of the perfected ones. The ultimate aim of life is to realize, to fully manifest the perfection that has always already been the true nature of the soul, a nature that has been obscured by the presence of karmic matter. Basically, we need to clean our souls off, according to Jainism. According to Vedanta, we're all undergoing a similar process. Rather than literal physical particles of karmic matter adhering to the soul and obscuring its true nature, Vedanta, especially Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Vedanta, focuses upon our consciousness, our false belief that we are a body, a being that is characterized by the limits of space, time, and causation. As in Jainism, it is taught in the Vedanta tradition that our true nature is not of this limited physical nature. And those of you who saw my presentation here on Vedanta and Star Wars might remember Yoda's famous quote, right? "Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter." As in Jainism, it is taught in the Vedanta tradition that our true nature is infinite bliss. We are infinite beings. We are infinite consciousness. In both traditions, our reality is one of infinity that has been limited by association with the finite. In Advaita Vedanta, this limitation is only apparent and is removed by the achievement of knowledge, or jnana, the realization that we are in fact not limited beings, but that our true nature, our Atman, is identical with the infinite Brahman that is the foundation of all existence and the ground of all being. In Jainism, this limitation is not merely an apparent one, but is a function of energies that have become associated with the soul, from which the soul needs to disassociate itself. In Advaita Vedanta, our bondage is an effect of our ignorance, or of Maya, which makes reality appear to us other than it truly is. In Jainism, our ignorance is an effect of our bondage, a consequence of the karmic energies adhering to the soul. You might say that according to Advaita Vedanta, we're having a dream that we're held down by some terrible weight. And then when we wake up, we realize that weight was never there. You could say that in Jainism, we are being held down by a terrible weight, and we have to push it off. Right? So I think this is the core difference between the two traditions. The difference is a subtle one, though, and it's obscured by the fact that a Vedantin would certainly agree that our bondage, our experience of identifying with the body, has reinforced our ignorance, our mistaken sense that the body is really what we are. And a Jain would certainly agree that overcoming our ignorance, learning about the true nature of the soul, and experiencing it through spiritual practice is an essential component in freeing ourselves from our bondage. The difference thus must not be overstated. Both are about the same basic spiritual project of liberation. The shared purpose of spiritual liberation and realization of our true nature, the manifestation of our true self, also gives rise to shared values and practices between Jains and Vedantins. Jainism and Vedanta both, for example, teach that the acquisition of liberating spiritual knowledge is not simply a cognitive matter, right? It's not, in other words, simply a matter of reading books and listening to lectures and learning true things, right? Would that it were so easy. We'd all be liberated right now. You just read Swamiji's complete works and, okay, I've got it. It is a matter of direct realization which must occur through practice. Both traditions teach that making the mind a suitable vehicle for realization requires moral training. Bad habits or sanskaras that run contrary to the aims of the spiritual path must be replaced by good ones. I saw another one of my former students there. Sorry. Hi, Michelle. Indeed, the 5 vows or vratas that define the basic teachings of Jain morality are identical to the 5 yamas found in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, a text that's been adopted into the Vedanta tradition for many centuries, even though the Yoga tradition was originally a school of thought distinct from Vedanta. These 5 shared moral principles that ground the practice of both Jainism and Vedanta are, first of all, ahimsa, nonviolence in thought, word, and deed. Ahimsa is not merely refraining from harming other living beings, right? That should be fairly easy. We're all practicing it right now. But it's being free even from the desire to see others come to harm, right? Even that anger that you might feel when, someone nearly runs over you in New York or some other difficulty in life occurs, we get angry. To let go of any sort of hostility to other living beings. It's also not a state of indifference to the suffering of other living beings. Although it's phrased negatively as the absence of the desire to harm, ahimsa in practice really amounts to daya, or compassion, an active love and concern for the welfare of all beings. This is something that Jains have been at great pains to explain in the modern world, because some of the earlier generations of scholars of Jainism would criticize the tradition. They would say, well, don't do any harm, but you're not being encouraged to go and do any good. And the Jain's point is that, no, if you really desire the welfare of all beings, if you wish no harm to come to any being, then you're actively involved on some level in protecting beings from harm. After ahimsa, there is satya, the truth, to which both traditions are absolutely committed. Thirdly, there is asteya, not stealing, which is followed by brahmacharya, or chastity, and aparigraha, or detachment, both from material things and from thoughts and emotional states that distract us from the spiritual path, what we might broadly call negativity, fear, and so on. Jains also share a number of other practices with Vedantins. Both traditions revere sages who have achieved realization and who have taught the spiritual path to others. In Jainism, these are primarily the Tirthankaras, 24 spiritual teachers who found the path to freedom and reestablished the Jain community over the course of our current cosmic cycle. The last such teacher to appear in our world for this cycle was Mahavira, the great hero. Mahavira was a contemporary of the Buddha who lived roughly 2,500 years ago in northern India. Like the Buddha, he was born to the royal class, and like the Buddha, he renounced the world around the age of 30 in order to pursue spiritual liberation for himself and for the benefit of all beings. Like the Buddha, he established a community of ascetics and a wider community of lay followers. Similarly, in the Vedanta tradition, we have a community of male and female ascetics, our swamis and pravajikas, and a wider community of householders, the rest of us. Just as the Jains revere the Tirthankaras, we in the Vedanta Society revere Sri Ramakrishna, the Holy Mother, Swami Vivekananda, as adherents of the various traditions of Vedanta, revere their founding figures, sages such as Shankara, Ramanuja, Nimbarka, Madhva, Vallabha, and so on. And while Jains do not affirm a need for a single supreme deity to preside over the cosmic process, they do affirm, like Vedantins, the divinity of the soul. As Jainism scholar John Court has pointed out, the Jain concept of divinity is a collective one. Jains do use terms such as Dev, Bhagavan, and the English word God to refer to the sum total of liberated beings. those who have fully manifested the divinity that is inherent in all of us in the form of the jiva, or the living soul. So while Jains do not teach the existence of a creator God, it's not quite correct to call Jainism atheistic. There is a sacred reality that Jains revere. And very often this causes confusion because in the Western world, we typically use the word God to refer to a creator, really referring back to a Christian context. And coming from that background, when I went to a Jain temple for the first time in India and was told by a monk, "God bless you," I thought, what is he saying, right? You're not supposed to be talking about God, you're a Jain, right? But he's referring to the blessing coming from the enlightened beings, right? These beings make up the divinity. This divinity is the Jinendra mentioned in the greeting Jai Jinendra, which I used at the beginning of my talk. Jinendra refers to all beings who've attained liberation and who are also Jitendriya, that is, they have overcome attachment to the senses. And this is, of course, the goal of Vedanta as well. Finally, the Jains also revere various Hindu deities as beings capable of providing assistance in times of need, such as the goddesses Lakshmi and Saraswati, Lord Ganesha. You'll see representations of these three deities very prominently in most Jain temples. Jains celebrate Diwali, for example, and also it has a special Jain meaning because that's also the day that Mahavira attained his final enlightenment and left his body. So there's a lot shared between the Jain tradition and Vedanta and what we might call the wider Hindu tradition. The difference mentioned earlier, though, between the basic vision of Vedanta and that of Jainism does lead to a difference in emphasis between the two traditions. This difference, again, is that from a Jain point of view, it is our literal bondage to karmic energies adhering to the soul that is the source of our ignorance. While from the point of view of Vedanta, especially Advaita Vedanta, it is our ignorance that gives rise to our bondage. Because Jainism is focused on purifying the soul of karmic matter, there is a much greater emphasis in this tradition on a highly rigorous ascetic process aimed at not only mental but also physical purification. If you think of it this way, if our problem is because of an external factor, then we have to do something about it, right? So there's a very strong emphasis on that. Whereas if it's internal, if it's a matter of a change in consciousness, then you're going to have a more inwardly focused, contemplative kind of tradition. And I think this really summarizes the difference between Jainism and Vedanta to a great extent. Jain ascetics seek to practice ahimsa, the non-harming of any living being, to the greatest extent that is humanly possible. And even Jain laypersons go to great lengths to avoid harming any living being, cultivating a lifestyle of maximum nonviolence. And if you study Jainism, it's interesting. You become very acutely aware of how every action you take can affect other living beings, especially on the microscopic level. Jain householders, to some extent, have to accept this fact, rather sadly. But in order to live and work and move about in the world, one needs to engage in activity. But for the Jain ascetics, it's a much, much stricter practice. It's really an attempt to be as nonviolent as humanly possible. This indeed is the thing for which Jains are known best, for practicing not only strict vegetarianism, for example, but also avoiding even certain vegetables, like root vegetables, whose consumption involves killing an entire plant. I've seen Jains at a religious gathering near Philadelphia clustered along the sidewalks near their temple to avoid stepping on the grass and harming not only the small life forms that might be crawling there, but also the grass itself. Jain munis and sadhvis, or monks and nuns, depending on the particular Jain tradition to which they belong, will often wear a face mask, a mupati or mouth shield, to avoid accidentally inhaling or ingesting small life forms like insects. Many carry a whisk or broom to sweep the ground in front of them, to avoid accidentally stepping on an insect, and to sweep any space on which they might sit, also to avoid injuring small living beings. Because Vedanta is focused on the transformation of consciousness, on purifying the mind, the practice of Vedanta is focused more on the cultivation of inner states than on the outward impact that we might have upon the world. 3 of the 4 yogas taught by Swami Vivekananda are aimed specifically at making the mind a fit vehicle for realization. Through Jnana Yoga, the path of wisdom, one develops one's discernment in order to differentiate between the real and the unreal, between Brahman and its appearance as Maya. Through bhakti yoga, one subordinates the ego completely to the personal form of Brahman, using the power of love to achieve realization and submerging the ego completely into the divine beloved. Finally, through Raja Yoga or Dhyana Yoga, the path of meditation, one allows one's consciousness to be absorbed completely in the contemplation of the divine self within, the state of samadhi. Even Karma Yoga, though, in which one dedicates oneself to the service of others, the focus is not so much on achieving results in the external world as on the effect this has upon our own consciousness, through overcoming the ego by subordinating it to the service of others. This is why Swami Vivekananda, when explicating Karma Yoga, explains that in helping the world, we help ourselves. The main effect of work done for others is to purify ourselves. By means of the constant effort to do good to others, we are trying to forget ourselves. This forgetfulness of self, meaning ego, self with a small s, is the one great lesson we have to learn in life. That's from Volume 1 of the Complete Works. In order for such service to be effective in eradicating the ego and leading to liberation, there must be complete detachment from the fruits of that action. One must not worry about success or failure, but simply dedicate oneself to the work as it is good in its own right. And one must certainly not worry about receiving gratitude or recognition. If we do our work with these things in mind, then we simply receive the karmic result that is its outcome, rather than purifying the mind for the sake of liberation. And I always think of a saying of Jesus, actually, when I think of this topic of karma yoga. He talks about people who do good in a very ostentatious way so that they receive praise from the community. And he says they have their reward already, right? So if we do good in the hope of some karmic result, whether it's something concrete like praise, or we think we're storing up some good for ourselves in the future, we receive that because that's how the universe works, but that's a very paltry reward compared to liberation. If we do our work without these things in mind, if we work for the good itself, but for the overcoming of the ego and the dawning of spiritual realization, our consciousness will be transformed. So really all the yogas are aimed at the transformation of consciousness, even the one that involves doing a lot of external work and activity. Again, the difference between Jainism and Vedanta in this regard is subtle and should not be exaggerated. Certainly, the Jain practice of ahimsa, while outwardly devoted to the protection of living beings, also results in a transformation of consciousness. Indeed, Jain ascetics will often say that they see their practice of nonviolence as a way of cultivating mindfulness. You become hyper-aware of your environment and what you're thinking and feeling and how you're relating to the beings around you when you're practicing nonviolence in this way. Similarly, it is not the case that Vedantins do not care about the good of the world, right? Even while we're working to transform our consciousness, we do quite a bit. Swami Vivekananda would not have made the long journey in 1893 to spread Vedantic teaching in the West, nor would he have initiated the work of the Ramakrishna mission if he were not motivated by deep compassion for the sufferings of others, both spiritual and physical. And we read of how both Swamiji and Sri Ramakrishna would weep for the poor that they would see in India whenever they traveled around the country. The difference in the metaphysical visions of these two traditions, though, the emphasis of one on material energies actually adhering to and impeding the vision of the soul, and of the other on a fundamental misconception of the nature of existence that needs correction on the level of consciousness, these could be seen to correspond to the greater strictness of Jainism in terms of actual practice of nonviolence and the greater emphasis of Vedanta on meditative and contemplative practice. So this is kind of, in a nutshell, the similarities and differences between Jainism and Vedanta. So how did I become interested in all of this? People often ask me that, and I'm going to talk about it because it actually leads into yet another connection between these two traditions that I think is really the most fundamental one. Again, I'm often asked how I came to have a deep interest in Vedanta and in Jainism. First, regarding Vedanta, I frequently told the story, some of you might have heard this story before, of how the loss of my father, and it's Father's Day, just thought about that. The loss of my father when I was a child led to an interest in, and eventually culminating in a lifelong commitment to Vedanta. I was brought up in the Roman Catholic tradition of Christianity, My family and I lived in a small town in Missouri called Montgomery City. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it. It's very small. I was my parents' only child, but our extended family was very large, aunts, uncles, cousins, and so on. And my wife has pointed out that, in fact, in many ways, it's not like an Indian family. It's a very big extended family. When I was 10 years old, my father was in a terrible accident that left him unable to live a normal life. Over the course of a year and a half, he was moved from various hospitals to various rehabilitation centers and finally came home to live with us. Our living room became a hospital room dedicated to his care, and my mother's full-time job became looking after his health and well-being, and she would later go on and become a nurse as her profession. When I was 12, my father's despondency over what had happened to him led him to take his own life. In the months that followed, I began to think very deeply about philosophical questions like the nature of the afterlife and the meaning of suffering. Why does God allow so much suffering in the world? Is there a God? What, if anything, happens to us after we die? Is there such a thing as cosmic justice? Is it possible for us to know the answers to questions like this? And if so, how might we do so? In the course of my questioning, I became inspired by a number of sources. I found a great deal of inspiration and much wisdom in the teachings of my Catholic faith. There were also some things, though, that did not entirely make sense to me. I especially began to question traditional Christian teaching about the afterlife. It seemed that if there was such a thing as cosmic justice, then both heaven and hell, eternal joy and eternal suffering, seemed like rather extreme options. It seemed more likely to me that our next life would be something like this one, a mix of joy and suffering, corresponding to the fact that most of us are not purely good or purely evil. We're a little bit of both. We would have experiences that would teach us and help us to evolve toward greater perfection. I was convinced by my father's experiences that we are not this physical body. My father's body had become a prison to him. If our body can be a prison to us, if it can turn against us, then it must be something distinct from the self. I believe that when my father took his own life, he'd freed himself from this prison. I also, however, did not believe that he had attained to cosmic perfection. It seemed to me more likely that his journey would continue in another form. I began to believe, essentially, in the idea of karma and rebirth, though I had not heard of or read about these ideas at all. But I also began to get clues from popular culture. Like most Americans, I got a lot of my, worldview and inspiration from popular culture. I know that my good friend Phil Goldberg spoke here, I think it was last week, right, on the influence of Vedanta on popular culture. In his book, American Veda, he talks about the music of George Harrison of the Beatles, and how Harrison's journey continues to inspire many even today. Quick aside, he actually mentions me in his book as a person not from the 60s generation, but who was inspired by Harrison. He's talking about how this inspiration has now become multi-generational. And I'll also mention that if you look in the acknowledgments page of American Veda, you'll see the names of 7 of my former students from Elizabethtown College, whom Phil hired to transcribe interviews for him when he was writing the book. So, yay, Eton, we had a little hand in American Veda. I was fascinated by the philosophy that Harrison expressed in his music and in the cover art of his albums, by his references to Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita. I also saw the film Gandhi at this time and was similarly fascinated by Gandhi and read everything I could find about him. In Gandhi's writings, too, I found references to the Bhagavad Gita. Finally, I came upon the Gita itself at a flea market held in the parking lot of the local Methodist church. Upon opening it, I came upon its teaching of the immortality of the soul and the reality of rebirth. In the Gita, I found a philosophy that made perfect sense to me, that had answers to my questions that were both rational and intuitively appealing. Like many Westerners, I found in the philosophy of Vedanta a middle path between Western religion, which makes appeals to faith, but is not always satisfying on the rational level, and Western science, which is rational, but does not always satisfy our need for a deeper meaning behind our experiences and our spiritual aspirations. I've sometimes joked that finding the Bhagavad Gita was like being an extraterrestrial raised by humans and then finding an artifact from your home planet. It's sort of what it felt like when I came upon it. One of the teachings of the Gita that I found appealing was its teaching that no person is condemned forever based on their religious practice. Lord Krishna says to Arjuna, "In whatsoever way living beings approach me, thus do I receive them. All paths lead to me. It's the 11th verse of the 4th chapter of the Gita. This is, of course, a verse quoted by Swami Vivekananda in his famous Sisters and Brothers of America speech at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. Another book that I read early on in my search was Houston Smith's The Religions of Man, which is where I first read about Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna's teaching that all paths lead to God was deeply appealing to me, that the various names by which ultimate reality is known in the world's traditions are but different names for the same infinite one. As Ramakrishna teaches, just as people call water by many names in their various languages and draw it from many sources, it is nevertheless the same water. In the same way, people approach the infinite from different perspectives, based on their cultural and religious backgrounds and prior philosophical assumptions, and call it by different names and conceive of it in different ways. Sometimes as a supreme being, sometimes as a consciousness, sometimes as just the universe itself. Ramakrishna also cites the ancient Indian story used by Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists alike of the blind men and the elephant to illustrate this point. If we all seem to be talking about different things in our various traditions and systems of philosophy, it's not necessarily because one of us is right and the rest are wrong. It may be that each of us has just a small piece of the total reality in our grasp, just as each blind man grasped only a portion of the elephant. To cite Pravajika Vrajaprana, each religion is like a piece of a puzzle. Each piece is different from the rest, but each can fit together to form a larger vision of reality. This made much more sense to me than the attitude I encountered among many in my small Missouri town, where even being Roman Catholic was considered to be practicing the wrong form of Christianity, right? That even being Catholic was edgy in the Bible Belt, right? In the heavily evangelical environment where I lived, I was told more than once that I was going to hell for being Catholic. And when my conversation partners found out that I was not only Catholic, but a strange Catholic who believed in reincarnation and read books about Hinduism, then they knew I was going to hell. This whole idea of going to hell, especially for following the religion in which one has been brought up, and which one had as much reason to trust as the evangelicals had for trusting their religion, seemed to be terribly unfair, and certainly unworthy of a God in whom the evangelicals claim to believe, who is said to be a being of infinite love. It made much more sense, if God is a God of love, if the divine truths that we need to know in order to draw nearer to God were distributed around the world through time and space, and not dependent on the activity of missionaries to spread them, right? What about the people who were born before the missionaries got to them, right? It just seems terribly inefficient. This would mean that sacred truths could be found in all religions and cultures. And this is the thesis I discovered in the work of another book I read around that time, another devotee of Vedanta, Aldous Huxley, in his classic work, The Perennial Philosophy. So I was a weird kid. I was coming to school with the Perennial Philosophy and the Bhagavad Gita and Autobiography of a Yogi and all these, things. This is what I was into, and it became my career. This perspective also made sense, I thought, from a scientific point of view, what you might call a scientific point of view. If there is such a thing as objective reality, if the universe is a certain way, then it would make sense if smart people from around the world had all been able to perceive some of its central features, just as we can all agree, more or less, on the nature of the physical reality that we together inhabit. And sure enough, one does find, even though there are important differences among them, that certain insights about the nature of reality, the mind, the self, morality, can be found in a variety of religions and philosophies and cultures from around the world and throughout history. As I grew older, I chose to pursue a career as a scholar of religion precisely because these kinds of questions are so fascinating to me. If I had had a normal job, this is what I would be talking about with people and reading about on my own. So might as well just do that, right? Most scholars of religion are more interested in social and historical issues than metaphysical ones, I discovered. While I have, of course, needed to learn and have enjoyed learning about those things, my main interest has been in philosophy, and my primary training in graduate school was in the philosophy of religion. The particular view that I came to hold regarding the presence of truth in many religions and philosophies is known by scholars as pluralism. As I finished college and began my graduate studies in the early 90s, I found that pluralism had some strong advocates, scholars with names like John Hick, Paul Knitter, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, and Raimundo Panikkar, on whose work I wrote my undergraduate thesis. But I also found that it was a position under siege. On the one hand, conservative Christian theologians took exception to the pluralistic view that there was nothing unique in any ultimate sense about Christianity, that it was one more path to ultimate truth among many. On the other hand, philosophy and theology were themselves viewed and are still viewed with a good deal of suspicion by secular scholars. People like Houston Smith, who affirmed a thread of truth running through many religious traditions, were derided as ignoring the important differences among traditions. And the academy as a whole seemed to be moving in the direction of affirming difference over similarity, and viewing claims of similarity and sameness with suspicion. For it's often the case that we do project our own experience and understanding of reality onto the materials that we study. And it's certainly true that we need to be constantly on guard against engaging in projection of this kind. But of course, pluralism does not teach that religions are the same. Puzzle pieces are not identical to each other, but they're mutually coherent. So it's a search for a deeper consistency across traditions, really. It's a relational understanding of them, not saying this equals this equals this. I thus took arguing for this position to be my chief mission as a philosopher of religion. At an early point in my graduate studies, I began an in-depth study of Indian philosophy. I'd already read a good deal about Vedanta and about Hinduism more broadly, as well as Buddhism and other religious and philosophical traditions. But this was largely a private study, while my formal training in college was mainly in the Western tradition, having pursued a double major in theology and the Great Books program, or Program of Liberal Studies at the University of Notre Dame. It was while reading a book by the late Bimal Krishna Motilal, Logic, Language, and Reality, that I came upon his account of Jain philosophy. And there I believed I'd found the secret to arguing for a logically rigorous philosophy of pluralism. So this is where we come to, I think, the deep connection between Jainism and the Vedanta, especially of Sri Ramakrishna. The central metaphysical doctrine of Jainism is a teaching called in Sanskrit Anekantavada. That is the teaching of the complexity of existence. Existence is aneka, right? It has many dimensions. Reality, according to Jainism, is multifaceted. There is that in reality which is permanent and stable. There is that in reality which is impermanent and constantly changing. Vedanta and other systems of Hindu philosophy tend to emphasize the first aspect. Buddhism tends to emphasize the second. A complete understanding of reality, however, must be able to comprehend both. This is the Jain point of view. Differences in religious belief systems and philosophical worldviews arise based on which facet of reality one takes to be fundamental, which part of the body of the elephant the blind man grasps. In fact, however, reality encompasses a variety of aspects, each of which has its place in the larger cosmic picture. And the evidence for this is the fact that people perceive all of these different aspects. On the basis of this view, the Jain tradition develops another doctrine. On the basis of Anekantavada, you get something called Syadvada, which is an approach to truth based on the idea that all claims are in some sense true, in another sense false, in another sense both true and false, and in another sense neither true nor false, or indescribable, and so on. And then there are three additional non-redundant combinations of those four. So there's 7 senses of truth of any given claim. Again, if you remembered my talk on Star Wars and Vedanta, Obi-Wan Kenobi says the truths we depend on our point of view. And he explains how from a certain point of view, Luke's father was killed by Darth Vader. From another point of view, Luke's father was Darth Vader. And it depends on which aspect of truth you're talking about. The truth of our claims depends on the perspective from which they're made, the facet of reality that serves as their basis. So the claim of Buddhists that all is impermanent, sarvamanityam, is true. It describes a dimension of the nature of existence. But the Advaita Vedanta claim that all that exists is one eternal reality beyond the realm of time, space, and causation is also true, describing as it does yet another dimension of existence. In classical Indian philosophy, of course, adherents of Advaita Vedanta strongly rejected the Jain claim of the multifaceted nature of existence. So I don't want to be taken as saying that Jains and Vedantins have always been in perfect harmony. They wrote very strong polemics against one another. They didn't kill each other, but they said the other one was wrong, right? So According to classical Advaita Vedanta, Brahman alone is real. The world is an illusion, Jagat Mithya, right? Other systems of Vedanta, though, are closer to the Jain perspective, affirming the reality, for example, of the distinction between God or Ishvara and the individual soul or Jiva. This makes bhakti possible, according to Vedantins like Ramanuja, and also the distinctions amongst the Jivas themselves. The Dvaita, or dualistic system of Vedanta, in fact affirms difference rather than non-duality as the fundamental principle for interpreting the Upanishads, the Gita, and the Brahma Sutras. As another good friend of mine, Ayan Maharaj, who I think also has spoken here, has recently argued in his book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, and as I've similarly argued at various points, the approach of Sri Ramakrishna to these issues is distinct from those of the earlier interpreters of Vedanta, and bears important similarities to the Jain approach of Anikantavada and Syadvada, though I'll also note that I'm not claiming that Jainism historically exerted much influence on Sri Ramakrishna. I think he had very little interaction with Jains in his time. Ramakrishna takes a non-dogmatic approach to diverse paths, seeing the way each path conceives of reality as a function of which aspect of reality that path takes to be fundamental. And the three he discusses most often in his teachings are the impersonal Brahman, the self within, and the Bhagavan, the beloved, the personal God. Rather than seeing one of these as solely true and the others as false or lesser, Ramakrishna sees each as simply different, and each as appropriate to those who practice a path to realization based upon it. He did see there are places where he talks about non-duality as the highest level of realization, but that doesn't seem to mean that you can't also reach the goal through the other paths. In fact, he's very clear that you can reach the goal through the other paths. So there's a sort of a hierarchy. He has his own understanding of reality, but that does not require him to deride other systems of thought, and in fact, just the opposite. For Ramakrishna, what is important is realization itself, following one's path with complete and single-minded dedication. This is the emphasis you see in his teaching again and again. It is perhaps this very dedication that can sometimes sound like dogmatic absolutism, right? I was criticizing the evangelical Christians I grew up around earlier, but I also want to give them credit that they just really love Jesus, and that's good. I want them to. They don't have to then put anything else down, but it can stem from that strong devotion. And in fact, in a lot of our Hindu prayers, you'll see it's very striking. You'll see this expression, Anyata sharanam nasti. We have no other refuge but you. And the same person who is saying that prayer to, let's say, Goddess Lakshmi on one day may be saying it to Lord Shiva on another day, because the idea is they are all one. But when you're praying to your devata, or when you're focusing on that aspect of reality that you see as supreme, then that is where the complete focus should be. If I'm single-mindedly focusing on realizing the impersonal Brahman as an Advaita Vedantin, then perhaps I have no time for the personal God. Or if I'm absorbed in bhakti, perhaps I have no time for anything impersonal. But Ramakrishna's distinctive teaching, his message as the Yugavatar, the divine teacher of our era, is that even as we pursue our own path with complete devotion, we ought not disrespect the paths of others. As Thakur himself said in his typical humorous way, we all think our own watch tells the correct time. A friend of mine, Tony Stoltz, he's a Buddhist teacher in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, near where I lived. He had has a very nice way of talking about this. He says, as a man married to a woman, he talked from his own perspective. He says, I love my wife. I think my wife is the best, the most beautiful, the greatest woman in the world. That doesn't mean I think your wife is terrible and bad and an awful person, right? So our devotion to our path should be, I think marital devotion is a good way to think of this. You are wed to your path, but everyone else has their path, and that's good, right? Much more can be and should be said on this topic, but it's getting close to noon. Time does not permit me to go into much greater depth in regard to the various dimensions of Jainism and Vedanta. If I did have more time, one thing I would talk about, because I've written a bit about it and I want to do more research on this, there are different forms of Jainism. There's a tradition of Jainism called the Digambara tradition, one of the greatest Digambara teachers, most famous of the classical period, was named Kunda Kunda. And he had a teaching, he had an interpretation of Jainism that's very similar to Advaita Vedanta, because he also saw the fundamental issue as transformation of consciousness. And in a lot of his writing, it's very, very close to what we also see in Shankara. And it's not, we don't know for sure which of them came first, or there might be more than one of both of them and so on. But you see this interplay between the traditions. The shared insight of these two, Jainism and Vedanta, specifically the Jain teaching of Anikanta and the Vedanta of Sri Ramakrishna, is that reality can be approached in many ways, that there's truth to be found in many perspectives, and that it is essential to human advancement that all these ways be respected, that we learn to draw insight from one another through dialogue, and only then will our shared picture of the whole elephant, all of reality, become more complete. So, thank you so much. This is the end of my prepared remarks. And I think you have a tradition here of Q&A, so I'm happy to take questions in however much time we have. Yes?
Professor, thank you for this beautiful sharing. I'm very sorry for your father's loss.
Thank you.
So I have these two questions. One is, if Mahavir ever met Buddha? And the second one was, that Buddhism was in 6th century BC so popular.
Yes.
I think the entire North India
Yes.
became Buddhist. They left eating meat and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But the speed with which it was internalized,
Yes.
the same speed went out of it. Jainism stayed back.
Yes.
It gained traction, but not Buddhism.
Right.
So what were the historical reasons for such a, retrenchment of Buddhism and continued entrenchment of
Okay. Well, a complete answer would be another whole lecture, but I'll give some highlights. The first question is the easiest one, because to our knowledge, Mahavir and Buddha did not ever meet, but based on the scriptures of both traditions, they were aware of one another, and they never disparaged one another. But their followers were in sharp competition. And so in the Jain scriptures, you get stories of Buddhist monks being converted to Jainism, and in the Buddhist scriptures, you get stories of Jain monks being converted to Buddhism. But Buddha and Mahavira, to the extent they acknowledged one another, they spoke with respect of one another. So I think that's very powerful and profound. In terms of the fortunes of these two traditions, yes, I mean, they're almost diametrically opposed in terms of how their stories played out in India. As you said, Jainism survives to the present day as a very small, only about 5 million people, but very tight-knit and, vigorous community. Whereas Buddhism spread, it had an enormous impact, but then was fairly quickly absorbed into what we now call Hinduism, and also spread outside of India very quickly to China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Tibet, and so on. So the historical factors there are many in number. In regard to Jainism, one of the reasons it remained more prominent in India and didn't really go out until the modern period has to do with the practice of ahimsa by the Jain monks. They have to walk barefoot, and they can only travel by foot. They're not allowed to travel in any vehicle, because anything that's rolling across the ground might be killing small organisms. So you have a tradition that's dependent on how far a person can walk on foot in a day. So it's not going to spread very, very far. Now there were Jain householders, there were Jain merchants who sailed all over the place. They went to the Middle East, they went to Southeast Asia, but they weren't really proselytizing their tradition. They were doing business. And in terms of Buddhism, I think one thing that happened in the Buddhist tradition, if you learn the intellectual history of Buddhism is a very complex, very subtle philosophy, and difficult for the average person to understand. And then when India was invaded in the sort of medieval period, a lot of the monasteries were destroyed. So the Buddhist intellectuals who could have said, well, this is what Buddhism means, were no longer there. They were no longer present. And so for the average practitioner, it was hard to differentiate between Buddhist practice and Hindu practice. And in fact, if you look at the periphery of South Asia, if you look at places like Nepal and Sri Lanka where Buddhism survived, it largely coexisted with Hinduism. If you go to Japan, for example, most Japanese people will have a Shinto wedding and a Buddhist funeral. This is because there's not such a thing as a Buddhist wedding. I think maybe Buddhist wedding rituals have been invented in more recent times, but Buddhism has typically coexisted with other traditions. So what did Buddhists in India do? Well, they would have a Hindu wedding, right? And like Jains, they also prayed to Vedic deities. If you go to Buddhist temples in Japan, you see Vedic deities as guardians of the temple and so on. So it was very easy for it to just become acclimated to the Indian environment. And then, of course, when Shankaracharya came along, and his understanding of Advaita Vedanta really took up the mantle of a lot of the things the Buddhists were saying and applied it to the Upanishads and even, the form of monasticism and so on. For the average person, it was not, I think, clear what the difference was. They just became one. So that's a short version. There's a lot more that could be said. Both these traditions had people who were hostile to them or who supported them at different times, and that all feeds into it as well. Yes?
Thank you again for the beautiful lecture and all the courses you've taken up.
Okay.
Two questions mainly. One is, you mentioned that in Jainism, the world has always existed.
Right.
So that brings a question that, then what would you say is the origin of bondage versus Advaita Vedanta, where it's a context of ignorance?
Right.
That's my first question. And the other question I was provoked to think this when you shared the experience about your father's illness and death.
Right.
So recently, the Indian court has outlawed the Jain intermittent death by fasting.
Right.
Known as Santhara.
Yes.
And especially in the light that even in the United States, in about 7 to 9 states, assisted death is legalized.
Right.
So I was curious to know your opinion on what you think about Santhara.
Okay, very good. So in regard to the first question, how did our bondage start according to Jainism? And there, I think you see a common thread throughout the Indic traditions, which is it simply affirmed that this has always been the case. That rather than an origin of bondage, an idea that pure souls originally sort of somehow fell into matter or something like that, you don't see a story like that. And I once heard the Dalai Lama, actually, from a Buddhist point of view, give an answer that I think a Jain would find acceptable as well, which he says, when you see mud, you don't ask, well, how did the dirt become mixed with the water? But you can separate the water from the dirt, and through a process of evaporation and so on, you can have pure, clean water on one side and dirt on the other. So they can be differentiated, but you don't, for that process, need to know a story about how water and dirt came together. They were just always together. So you don't really get, to my knowledge, an origin story. When the Buddha was often asked about the origins of bondage, he was often silent. And he took it to mean, you're in bondage, so don't worry about that. Worry about how you get out of bondage, right? And similarly in Jainism, it simply said that this has always been the case, but it need not forever be the case, that the liberation of the soul is possible, and people like Mahavira demonstrate that. A couple of other points I think that can be made in this regard. Very often in the Western world, we like to focus on origins. We like to focus on origin stories. There were people in the early Christian church who believed in rebirth and who believed that there were pure souls in heaven who became enamored of the material world and then fell into the material world and were trying to find their way out. And I mean, that's something an individual might believe, but it's not what you typically find in Jainism or in Hinduism or Buddhism. Another answer that I really liked was given by Pravajika Gatriprana in the Vedanta tradition. When someone once asked her, if Brahman is perfect and all blissful, why did it become us? Why did it become this universe? And her answer was, well, get realization, and then you'll know why you did that. And so it encourages practice and finding that divinity within us. In regard to the second, do you mind repeating the second question?
It's about Santhara.
Oh, yes. Santhara, yes. So Santhara, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, there is a practice in Jainism in which if one becomes very detached from the physical body And then especially if one is in a situation as a monastic where it's difficult to practice the strict regime, one has the option of voluntarily giving up the body. You stop taking food, you basically starve to death. And it's also called salekana, and there's a very good book on this called Salekana is Not Suicide. And it explains the difference that a suicide in the traditional sense in any part of the world is when one, out of very negative emotions, out of great despondency or anger or some disappointment, one ends one's own life. But that's believed to bring very bad karma to the soul. And so Salekana or Santara is just the opposite, where you have reached a state of perfect nonviolence and you don't want to destroy any other living being by consuming anything, so you just give up the body. There's a beautiful story that illustrates this. There was a famous Jain philosopher in the 5th century named Samantabhadra, and he contracted leprosy. And so he was understandably upset. Leprosy is not a very pleasant ailment to have. So he went to his guru, and you have to get the permission of your teacher. He went to his guru and asked, he said, I would like to perform this santara and get rid of this body. And his guru denied him permission. He said, you're just upset because you got leprosy. It's unpleasant, it's uncomfortable, but that's the physical world. So he says, you have to learn to accept this. So go and meditate for a year, and then we'll speak again. So Samantabhadra goes, he meditates for a year, then he comes back to his master. His master says, so tell me what you're thinking. He says, Master, I've meditated for a year. I realize now that I am the soul, I am not the body. I don't really care what happens to this body, so I leave the decision to you. Should I take Santara or not? I don't care. And then the master said, now you're ready to take Santara, right? So that's the philosophy behind this. Now, this became a big controversy recently because there were some pretty young people, children by some measure, who wanted to do this. And I think there were also some cases where some fairly wealthy elderly people wanted to do this and were being encouraged by their younger relatives. And so I think the Indian court took the decision that, okay, this is being abused. This is something that people are using to either get rid of children they don't want or get rid of elderly people they don't want and take their money, and this will not do. I think the situation in the United States is very different, where we've developed healthcare, and this was my father's problem. In fact, he wrote a letter to the paper about this when he had me type it for him when he had his injury, that we have developed our medical technology to the point where we can extend life a really long time, but the quality of that life it can be very, very poor. And so people want the dignity of saying, okay, I'm done, right? And people have different beliefs about this, right? I remember one of my favorite comedians, the late George Carlin. I won't insert all the bad words that he uses, but there are people who say, oh, if I'm in that condition, pull the plug. And he said, leave my plug alone, don't touch my plug, because maybe they'll find a cure and you'll be okay. So people have different. So the idea is in America, we have this sort of a libertarian philosophy where our life is our own, and so we should have the right, the decision to say what kind of care we want to receive and beyond what point. And in fact, I know with some of my older relatives, it's become and some of our elderly friends that have passed recently, that it's actually become common now where people can have directives where they don't want certain kinds of care. It's not physician-assisted suicide, but it's not taking every possible measure to extend life, with the understanding that might not really be a good life to have. So I think it's different circumstance. I think in India they're trying to stop the greedy relatives. I think here people are trying to, take control of the decision about their own life.
The Delhi High Court has put a moratorium on this prohibition.
Yeah.
But then the Supreme Court has allowed it.
Okay.
Yeah, because
It's always developing.
The High Court judges to consult with the Jain munis
Yes.
and take their opinion. But unlike the United States, where anything religious, they don't want to touch that.
Right.
The United States is hands off religion, private.
That's right.
Indian courts, on the other hand, because they're seized with these social evils, like sati was there.
Yes.
Women kill themselves,
Right.
They said, to hell with this monopoly of the religious by the
Right.
priest. We will intervene, we'll see. We need to put the record right. There's a lot of abuse
Right.
Goes in the name of religion.
Yeah, I mean, and both systems have their problems, but they're different models of secularism in India and the U.S. And the Indian courts are quite willing to get involved in what we would here regard as religious issues. And the courts here, too, will sometimes get involved in religious issues, but not as religious issues. So, for example, a religion in America could not practice human sacrifice. Now, that's because murder is illegal. But if you believe in human sacrifice, you can believe that all you want. Just don't do it, right? So from an American point of view, the problem is, specific acts that are illegal. But you can't legislate someone's belief in America. In India, it's much more. I think they've tried to replicate King Ashoka's model, where he was sort of advocating pluralism and people learning about each other's religion and so on. But again, both systems have. It's always in the details. You can agree on a principle, but then when you get to an actual case, it then becomes extremely messy.
Would Jains ever become a separate religion? Like they will call themselves non-Hindus?
Well, most of the Jains I know would. Well, in fact, I asked this question when I was writing my book on Jainism, and the answer I got the most was they said, "We're religious. Our religion is Jainism. We are culturally Hindu." And because they see themselves as participating in the larger Hindu culture, but they don't believe in the Vedas. They have their own scriptures. They have their own beliefs and so on. So it's ambiguous. There's a lot of intermarriage between Vaishnav Hindus and Jains in Gujarat. So you have a lot of families where people are, in a sense, both. So it does become complicated. I think there's another question in the back there.
So in the Vedanta tradition, there's this idea that there are realized people that you can get there, and that it's a blessing to sit at their feet.
Yes.
Is that in James, is it like it's happening now, and this is something that people aspire to?
Oh, yes. The two traditions are very much the same in that way. And I said that in terms of worship, the emphasis is mainly on the 24 Tirthankaras, but a great variety of other sages are revered in the Jain tradition, and including ones who live fairly recently and who are believed to have, either reached moksha or have gone very far in the direction of moksha. In that sense, Jainism is a lot like Buddhism, too, because Buddhism also teaches there have been many Buddhas in the past, there'll be Buddhas in the future, and there are arhats, that is, people who attain enlightenment following the teaching of a Buddha. So there are people who, like an enlightened being of any kind in Jainism is called Jinna, which is where the word Jain actually comes from. And the Tirthankaras are a subset of those. But yeah, there are sages who lived maybe 400 or 500 years ago who have temples dedicated to them in places like Rajasthan and Gujarat and so on.
But being like now,
I know less about. I've never heard of that, but I don't want to say no because there's always something I don't know, and then someone says, there is one. So I'm not aware of it. I think it's fairly rare that would be taught, because there's also a view in Jainism similar to what you find in Buddhism, that the world is sort of now winding down. I mean, we still have million, billion years to go, but that the last Tirthankara has come. So it's just going. It's like the Kali Yuga. It's just going to get worse until the next cycle. So it's relatively rare that you would find someone in Jainism claim to be a realized being, but I don't want to say that it has never happened or would rule it out. Yeah.
Would you consider the pluralism advanced by Sri Ramakrishna and the pluralism advanced by Jainism result in Sri Ramakrishna's case more of an experientially based Vidyani perspective as opposed to a Jainist philosophical?
I think the way you've just described them is a good way to distinguish them. That I wrote this massive dissertation about Jain philosophy when I was doing my PhD, and I concluded that Anikantavad is a logical deduction from certain claims about the nature of reality made early on in the Jain tradition. And interestingly, there's another scholar of Jainism, Piotr Balcerowicz from Poland. I think I've just butchered his name, but he's written a wonderful book on both the Jains and another early ascetic sect that died out, the Ajivikas, saying that he sees a practical basis also for Anikantavada, that this idea that something in a certain sense exists, in a certain sense is not, he sees it as arriving from early Jain efforts to determine what is a living thing and what is not a living thing. In other words, what is it okay to eat and step on, and what is it not okay to eat and step on? And that from that internal monastic conversation, this whole theory of reality arose. Whereas I think with Sri Ramakrishna, it was very much experientially based. It came from his samadhi experiences. I think I saw another hand back, then we can come back. Yes.
And I'm not sure that what I understood that gentleman, that you all accept the reincarnation also, and Vedanta also accept. Sri Ramakrishna began that if you take the example, you went up the stairs, up, you realize and come back, reincarnation is coming back.
Yes.
Carry on your knowledge, no problem. In case of mud, so I don't want to decipher the ingredients of mud, where, how much, but I must know, I should have stick into the mud. That you can say ignorant or knowledge doesn't matter the what, but it is true, if I know it is mud, I should not die or something. That definition can be knowledge or ignorance, doesn't matter. Something knowing is coming there. To understand it is mud, I will not stick to it.
Right.
Then Jain will say what? Ignorance now to knowing what is
No, I think Jains would say the same thing. I think you have a very subtle distinction on a philosophical level that the average practitioner of both Vedanta and Jainism might not even be really thinking about. But professional philosophers like me, we get very worked up about these things. And the basic question comes down to, is the realm of time, space, and causation, that's where all this happens or appears to happen, is that real, or is that merely an appearance or provisional to the true reality? Jains would say it's real, and then there are things you need to do within it in order to escape it. And from a Vedanta, at least Advaita Vedanta point of view, that very conception is itself the problem. And this is why the two traditions debated a lot in ancient times. Yeah. Yes. And the Jains would accept that also, yes. That's right. Do we have time for at least one more question? Okay. Okay. However long you all want to be here, yeah. Okay. Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, so like I know that Jains don't take food like after sunset. Is it a religious reason behind it, or there's something else behind it? That's one question. Second, maybe I missed it during the class. What is exactly the goal of a person who's practicing Jainism in their life? No, Vedanta is very clear.
Right. Yes. And I'll answer the second question first, because they are absolutely the same in that regard. That the soul is divine, and you want to realize that divinity, you want to realize the true nature of yourself that was already there all along, but that has been obscured in Vedanta by ignorance, in Jainism by this karmic energy that is adhering to the soul because of the way we operate in life. So, but the goal of realization is the same. The way it's described is the same. In fact, there was a great Jain sage, Haribhadra, was one of my favorite Jain philosophers, and he lived around the 8th century, and he has a text called the Yoga Drishti Samuchaya, and he talks about different yogas, that by which he means what we would call today different religions. And he says the goal they describe is all the same. It's free from suffering, it's free from ignorance, it's free from rebirth, it is one. And they call it by different names because of the different conditions and times in which they taught. And so this is very similar to Vedanta as well. In regard to why Jains traditionally don't eat after dark, is a very practical reason, but of course with the religious dimension. You don't want to harm any living things, and if you eat in the dark or dim light, you're more likely to accidentally ingest, let's say there's an insect crawling in your rice and you just spoon it up, and you want to avoid that. So you don't eat after dark. And moving about after dark is also not considered good for the same reason. You're more likely to step on something. So,
This was created when we didn't have it.
yeah, that's right. The existence of electric light means, it changes things a bit. I've just kind of it's not really related to your question directly, but your question just inspired me to share a quick story. Maho and I were at a Jain temple in India, and we heard the very renowned Jain nun, Sadhvi, give a talk, and great length about nonviolence and the importance of observing nonviolence, and just how, this is what you hear in Jainism all the time, ahimsa, ahimsa. And then it was time for snacks. And so we were lining up to have our, of course, vegetarian snacks. And I suddenly felt an intense pain in my hand. And I looked down and a wasp had just stung me. And he was sort of hanging around. And I almost felt like he was saying, "What are you going to do?" And I didn't. I practiced ahimsa. I let the wasp go, and my hand got better, and But it was interesting because it was almost like a test at that moment. Like I'm just hearing it, and I'm thinking, "Oh yes, nonviolence. This is very good." Ow, And then there's the wasp. Another quick story. There's a Jain center in New Jersey called Siddhachalam, Blairstown, New Jersey, and I've spoken there a few times. The first time I ever spoke there, Maho and I stayed in the guest house. And the next morning there was a conference about to start. So we walked out the front door, and there was this bird standing on the sidewalk. And he didn't move. And we were coming right up. We had to walk past him to go. And he just didn't move. He just sat there and said, so we thought maybe he's injured. Usually if you come upon a bird and it doesn't fly away, it can't fly away. And he was fine. He looked up at us, and then, he flew off. And then I realized that in that place, they practice ahimsa, and there are animals who come there, and the deer, and they're safe, and it's a very beautiful experience to be there. So, yes.
You talked about religious pluralism and Ramakrishna's emphasis on tolerance. Practice your own path intensely, but don't criticize anyone else's.
Yes.
There's an interesting story that happened with Ramakrishna that I'd like to hear your comment.
Mm-hmm.
Ramakrishna had passed away, and I'm sure you know this story. At the Jagannath temple, there was a Christian missionary who was abusing Hinduism.
Yes.
And the monks there felt pretty helpless how to deal with him.
Right.
And Swami Premananda came and started saying Haribol loudly, and the crowd joined him, and they drowned him out.
Right.
And everyone felt very happy, and the priest came and thanked him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That night, he has a dream, and Ramakrishna comes to him and says, "That man is also doing my work.
Interesting.
Go and apologize to him."
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
So a man who's abusing other religions is also doing God's
Yes,
work.
yes. That is very hard story, I think, to really. I have heard this story because my instinctive sympathies are with Swami Premananda. It's like, yes, we should not have this kind of thing going. We need to stand firmly for the truth and so on. At the same time, there is this challenge, I think, that pluralism presents, which is that when we say, okay, it's very easy for me to stand up here and say, okay, there's truth in all perspectives. But I hear things on the news, for example, that I really disagree with. And so the challenge to try to see the divinity in that other person and to try to find how that connects with what we do. And some of us were chatting last night about certain politician, and I won't mention, but saying, we need to see God in everyone, but it seems like there's this very thick coating of Maya over some souls, right? And it reminds me of the Jain idea. You have this sort of coating of karma on the soul. But yeah, Jesus says, "Judge not," and it's very hard because then we also feel obligated to take a moral stand sometimes when we see something. If we saw someone really being abused and we didn't intervene in some fashion, Martin Luther King said we're complicit if we don't, if we're part of the problem if we don't help solve the problem. So it's hard. I think where I finally come down is not on you should do this or not do that, but whatever you do, do it with love in your heart. Right? That even if you decide the right thing to do is to denounce the missionary, there should not be anger, there should not be hatred. And this is what the Gita teaches. Arjuna is being told to go out and actually kill people with no hatred in his heart. Now, Gandhi took that and said that means basically we're not supposed to kill anyone, right? Because that's not possible, right? Is what he is saying. But there are different ways of interpreting it. That to completely purify ourselves of any hostility to any other person, I would say even if we have to maybe speak sharply or stand firmly at certain times. There should be love in our heart. And that's hard. That's a very hard discipline sometimes to follow.
What do you think Ramakrishna would have said of this ISIS crisis?
I don't know.
They're doing his job too, Ramakrishna.
Well, okay, now here, actually, we get into a bigger, I think, deeper metaphysical question, which is why is there suffering at all in the universe? Because sometimes terrible misfortunes happen to us. And whether it's done by someone else, like a terrorist, or whether it's unfortunate, like we fall down the stairs and break our leg, whatever it is, that as time continues to unfold, sometimes we find there was a deeper purpose in that. So I hope my wife doesn't mind me mentioning this, but she broke her leg a few years ago and found out thereby that she had osteoporosis. So she got treatment for that, and it's all better now. Last year, she fell and had a head injury, which, if she still had osteoporosis, could have been it could have been a brain injury. As it was just a, as they say in Monty Python, only a flesh wound, right? It was nothing serious. So, in a strange way, we talk about this. It was almost good fortune that she broke her leg 4 years ago. And she broke our leg going to see our guru, actually, too, which is also interesting. So it's not a direct answer to your question, but I guess I'm answering your question with a question, which is, might it be the case that even in the darkest of times, when we see a lot of evil happening to us in our personal lives and in the world at large, that Ma's purpose is unfolding in ways that are mysterious to us. Now, I'm nervous saying that too, because it can become a fatalism where you absolve yourself of all responsibility to do good in the world. But even our doing good in the world, Swami Vivekananda says, you can't do any good for the world, But by trying to, you transform yourself. You transform your consciousness. So, I don't. What would Ramakrishna have done with ISIS? I'd like to think he might have gone there and tried to talk to them, and he might have died as a result. But he would have done that, and full of love.
You see, Guru Nanak suffered the same thing, and he cried.
Yes.
He said the justice has taken wings.
Yeah.
The justice
has flown away. Right.
Yeah. And it was butchering,
Yes.
like that every day. So.
Yes.
1,000 people massacred
Yes.
in the name of religion.
Yes.
He said, God, where are you?
There's another thing, too, to point out, which, again, I'm nervous saying it. It's a slippery slope. But every one of these traditions, and I would say including Jainism, while ahimsa is the highest goal, Jain householders are expected, they do have a duty to protect others, to protect their families. In ancient India, there were Jain kings. They had armies. They fought defensive wars. And the Dalai Lama really shocked a lot of people when, after Osama bin Laden was killed, someone was interviewing him and said, well, of course, isn't that terrible? And the Dalai Lama said, well, sometimes, unfortunately, in this realm of suffering, to prevent greater suffering, this thing might have to happen, And there was the whole Kshatriya class in ancient India whose purpose, of course, it got abused a lot, but spiritual purpose was to protect Dharma, to protect the good. So, it may be that it's necessary for householders to resort to force on some occasions. But again, we have to do it with love in our heart. The evil is not the other person, it's whatever has infected their consciousness to make them do that. Yeah. Yes?
I think this extreme ahimsa that also led to invasion by outsiders on India.
People have said that, but the average householder or the king was never expected to abide by ahimsa. So it was only monks and nuns who were practicing that. So I would question that claim. I don't think it was the practice of ahimsa that led to so many invasions of India. My personal analysis is that India was not a united country. And there were Indian kings who were quite happy to side with invaders against other Indian kings. And when the British began to make incursions into India, the Indians actually had superior technology to the British. The largest cannon in the world is in Udaipur. I've seen it. Had the Indians been united, the British would have just sort of traded with them, and that would have been the end of it. So I don't blame ahimsa, because ahimsa has always been sort of understood to occur within this very limited frame of life. it was never the case that I know of that an invader came into India and a king said, well, I'm not going to fight them because I believe in ahimsa. That never happened that I know of. But they would say, this person's going to help me get this other guy that I don't like. Yes. Okay, so I think we'll wrap up then now. And thank you all for your questions, and thank you for coming today. Jai Shri Ramakrishna.